All right. So let's introduce our first speaker. I met Calvin Fong quite a few years ago, I think, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. He can kind of confirm that for me. And he brought in to the History Center a scrapbook that he and his brother had compiled about their father's career. And I think this was the first scrapbook. I don't know if you could see that. But it was a great scrapbook of a world that I didn't really know anything about. I knew that there had been Chinese nightclubs and restaurants, certainly growing up here, but I didn't know how popular they were or how they were advertised or anything. And it just opened up a whole world for us, and it really added to, as many of our gifts do, added to our understanding of Oakland, and especially our Chinese community here. And so just to introduce Calvin. Calvin was born in Oakland near Chinatown. In the 1940s, his mother worked as a part-time evening hostess at Oakland nightclub, at the Oakland nightclub. She didn't want to leave her children at home, so she brought them along. And so the kids really got to see the shows. They were babysat by some of the performers, and who they found very fascinating people. There were musicians also, and acrobats. And they got to know these people and kind of understand what their father was doing and how he conducted his business. So also on the program, we'll have Cynthia Yee. She was a dancer with a Dorothy Toy show that traveled the world and performed at the Chinese Sky Room in San Francisco, Chinatown, whenever they were on hiatus during the 1960s. She's also the founder of the Grant Avenue Follies. Mimi Chen will also be on our program. She's a dancer with the Grant Avenue Follies, and her late husband was the owner of the Dragon A Go-Go nightclub in San Francisco, during San Francisco Chinatown during the 60s. They will be joining us as well. So we have a really packed program tonight. So we are going to throw it to Calvin Fong. Calvin, you ready to go?
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
All right. Welcome.
Thank you. Can you see the slide okay?
Yes.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. I want to first ask you a question. Did you know that the Chinatown nightclubs in the Bay Area were quite popular, especially during the 1940s and 50s? And their popularity actually began in the late 1930s and ran through the 1960s. I should mention that their popularity was primarily a Bay Area phenomenon, not a national one. Even though there were Chinese-owned nightclubs scattered across the country, including in Hawaii, but the major phenomenon was right here in the Bay Area. And that's because of the concentration of Chinese nightclubs, primarily in San Francisco, Chinatown, and one in particular in Oakland. Now, when I say popular, what I mean by that, it was very popular among Occidental Americans, and less so with the Asian community. Now, that might sound a little surprising, but that's what it was. Now, why was it so popular among the Occidentals? I think the main reason was that the Chinatown nightclubs carried, and I'll put it in quotes, an Oriental mystique. Now, I'm not going to define that term. I'll just use your own imagination of what you think that might be. And I don't want to go into any further discussion of the so-called Oriental mystique. We can certainly discuss that if you would like during the panel discussion a little bit later. But what I would like to do is actually move on. And I want to show you a short video of the many talented professional Chinese Americans that performed during this era. Oh, what happened?
Hello. Hello. I'm sorry. I'm gonna hang up.
You might have noticed some of the Hollywood celebrities that also came to the clubs, and that also increased the popularity of clubs at that time. I wanted to stop at this particular picture. Her name is Bertha Liu Hing. And can you guess?
Excuse me, before you go on, could you mute everyone? We can hear phone calls and people singing.
Bertha Liu Hing, can you guess what kind of a professional performer she was? No, she wasn't a dancer as far as I know. She was not a singer. In fact, she was the first recognized professional Chinese American woman magician in the United States. Her husband, Ah Hing, was also a magician, and they performed together. But Ah Hing during the World War II served in the military. So that left Bertha to kind of carry on the show solo. Now you see here, many of the pioneers were second generation, born here. Many grew up during the Roaring 20s, through the Great Depression, and certainly through World War II. Now at this time, the Chinese Exclusion Act was still very much enforced. And so many of the career opportunities for these young Asian American entertainers were quite limited, as it was for most minorities at that time. It wasn't easy to be an Asian entertainer. They had to go against cultural traditions. Some had to defy their parents, and even a few had to run away from home just to chase their dreams. So fortunately, there were some Chinatown nightclubs, particularly in San Francisco and one in Oakland, that allowed them to pursue and express their talents in singing and dancing as well. I believe that a lot of these pioneers helped open doors of opportunities for today's Asian entertainers, doors that were closed to them in the 1940s and going through the 60s and 70s. To the right below there, you see Ah Hing. That was Bertha's husband, and he served during World War II. Here, I wanted to just briefly point out the most popular clubs in the San Francisco Bay Area. 4 of the 5 were in San Francisco Chinatown. And they were popular in terms of numbers. And these are the clubs where most of the Occidental Americans went to see. The first one, let me magnify it a little bit, is the Chinese Sky Room right on Grand Avenue that was owned by Andy Wong. Next to it is the Kuba Khan, just down the street from the Sky Room, and it was owned by Eddie Pong. On Sutter Street, just around the corner of Grand Avenue, was the Forbidden City, and the owner was Charlie Lowe. Charlie Lowe, you can see in the picture, actually in the lower right-hand corner. And probably the Forbidden City was the most popular of all the clubs. And then below the Forbidden City was the Lion's Den, owned and operated by Andy Young. And that was farther down Grand Avenue. And then my father's club, the Club Shanghai, also on Grand Avenue, just a few doors down from the Chinese Sky Room and the Kuba Khan. And then in Oakland, my father's New Shanghai Terrace Bowl. Now, these places were not only destinations for the Hollywood elite, but they not only came to see the shows, but to be seen as well. And they came to see people like the Chinese Fred Astaire, the Chinese Ginger Rogers, or the Chinese Frank Sinatra, or the Chinese Betty Grable. And this really fascinated, I guess, the American palate, because they really weren't sure what they were going to find in Chinatown or what they were going to hear. So they came, they saw, they liked, and they came back, and that's what sustained the popularity. Now let's just draw back the curtains a little bit, and we'll go right into my father's clubs. You see here, it looks like 4 different clubs, but in actuality, there were only 2 clubs in existence at the same time. What happened was the club in Oakland actually morphed over time from one club to another and to another, as you will see. My father was really not into the restaurant business, believe it or not. His primary business, as Dorothy mentioned, was being a Chinese doctor, specializing in herbal medicine. That was his prime responsibility, and that was his day job. So what drew him into the restaurant and nightclub business? He was interviewed by the San Francisco Chronicle back in 1949. And this is what his answer was when they asked him, it has often been asked, why does Fong Wan own and operate restaurants and nightclubs? To put my dependents to work. And what that means is that he had a strong sense of filial piety, loyalty to the family. He had a strong sense of supporting his parents in China. He had a strong sense of bringing over several of his nephews, cousins, his younger brother, and other relatives over to America. And obviously, when he brought them over, he wasn't just going to let them go and, okay, you just do your thing and try to make things work out for yourself. No, he really wanted to give them a good head start. So he started the restaurant business and the nightclubs to give them some initial employment. So let's start off with the new Shanghai Cafe that he bought in 1927. It was a small dine and dance club. The previous owner was going bankrupt, and so he decided to buy them out. And this particular club, the New Shanghai Cafe, as you can see the address, was on 10th Street between Broadway and Franklin. That segment of 10th Street no longer exists, as you probably know. What sits there now is the Trans-Pacific Center building, if I remember right. But that's where it was. And he took this bankrupt cafe, turned it into a dine and dance restaurant. And let me go a little bit forward here. And for 11 years, he emphasized, notice the word healthy, good, healthy Chinese food. It was a typical Cantonese restaurant. And back in that time, you know, admittedly, Cantonese food was kind of greasy. And it was that lard, that animal fat that gave it that good taste. But my father wanted to try something different because he was an herbalist, because he was into health. And let's see what he did. Before we actually talk about the health food, I think the reason why the old restaurant that he bought out was not doing very well was because it was just on the outskirts of Chinatown on 10th Street. And it was between Chinatown and downtown Oakland. And I read a paper that was written by an expert or a scholar in Chinese American history. And he said that most restaurants that had a Chinese restaurant that had a Chinatown, it was very uncommon to have both Chinese and American dishes in the 1920s. And I think because most of the people that went for Chinese food went into Chinatown, and so there was no reason to have American dishes there. Certainly in the smaller towns around the United States, where there was no Chinatown, in order for the restaurant to survive, it had to have a combination of Chinese and American dishes. But the fact that my father's club was just on the outskirts, and the fact that the previous owner did not do very well, he decided to have a combination of Chinese and American dishes. So that was unusual for the time. I want to mention on the second floor there, that's where many of my father's dependents that came from China stayed. They stayed in the second floor loft. Also, in the 40s, my father brought over several types of entertainers from China just to perform exclusively at his clubs. Acrobats, magicians, and others as well. So some of them also stayed on the second floor. But also, I should mention that a lot of them stayed at our house too, I remember. Fortunately, we had a large basement. It was a big house. The basement itself was almost 3,200 square feet. So there was a lot of room to put people there. So many of the entertainers and some of the relatives stayed there. Now, getting back to the health food, how did he make it healthy? This may have been the first health food restaurant in America. I don't know. But let's see what he says. This was a 1929 ad. And it says here, herbalist Fong Wan's chief aim was to promote good health. And that was obviously consistent with his primary occupation of being an herbalist. And look at the second bullet. Will not serve strongly peppered, highly seasoned, greasy food. Well, how do you do that with Cantonese food? It's almost impossible. And look at the third bullet. Use only first-class pure peanut oil. He did not use lard or any type of animal fat. It was pure peanut oil. Obviously, it was popular because the restaurant ran beautifully for the next 11 years. Now, this is where he mixes advertisements between his herb business and the restaurant business. He talks about water chestnuts here. Good for high fevers, especially good with minced pork. And then he puts a plug in for his restaurant, well prepared at the New Shanghai Cafe. Now, these are highly unusual advertisements put out in the late 1920s, ran through the 1930s. And our father talked about the ancient art of Chinese cooking, especially as it was done at the New Shanghai Cafe in Oakland. And you can see at the first advertisement, just right on your left there, and he talks about the 5 natural elements, which is the basis for Chinese philosophy. Talks about the different minerals that are part of the universe, and he classifies different types of dishes based on these natural elements. And this is what he says: when these 5 elements are exactly proportioned, and that was his aim at the restaurants, the food balance is near to healthful perfection. And that's what he subscribed to as part of the human body. The human body contained these 5 natural elements. And if they were in balance or in equilibrium, you would be in good health. The same for foods that you eat. If they're exactly proportioned, it will be a very healthful type of diet. So that was highly unusual for a Chinese restaurant back then. The first health restaurant, perhaps, in America. Now, the second phase, after the 11 years, he expanded the restaurant and he incorporated great vaudeville entertainment, lots of variety of different types of shows. You can see here, he expanded and bought out some vacant buildings right next to the old restaurant.
Okay, I can't find, normally I would know what the speaker.
The question is, why did he expand? And it comes back to, he was bringing over more relatives. And so he had to get them employed as well. So he built the restaurant as the largest and most complete Chinese supper club on the coast. Now, whether that was true or not, I don't know. But he also mentions the only cafe offering floor show, music, dancing, singing at a very low cost. And in fact, it was quite large. The floor space was over 22,500 square feet, and can accommodate up to 500 people. So it was a rather large restaurant. This was probably the first Chinese classy restaurant on the East Bay side. Now, he opened this expansion in the summer of 1938. And then by a few months later, he had his first Chinese performer, J.D. Wong, who performed at the club. Now, J.D., if you remember what I said about a few women or a few of these ladies ran away from home to pursue their dreams, J.D. was one of those. She not only ran away from home once, but actually twice. And she finally ended up on the streets of Hollywood, where she danced for nickels and dimes and pennies. Fortunately for her, she was discovered by a 20th Century Fox executive. And he put her into the movies, into a movie called Mr. Moto Takes a Vacation. I don't know if you remember the old Japanese detective movies starring Peter Lorre. And this particular movie, Mr. Moto Takes a Vacation, came out in 1939. When she cut the movie, she came back apparently into the Bay Area, looking for ways to support herself. And she ended up at the Forbidden City as well as the New Shanghai Cafe in 1938. And this particular review says she had an unusual combination of dances. It says that she was an outstanding exponent of Oriental, Hawaiian, and acrobatic dancing. Quite unusual. My father loved magicians, and practically every show he had some magician from across the country. Here in this particular show, the great Lester, or Lester the Great, in fact, his most popular act was cutting a woman in half. And this particular show was actually portrayed in Life magazine and Look magazine at that time. In fact, it was so realistic. Here was what one reviewer said about this particular show. So perfect is the illusion that even at close range of 4 feet, I could detect no trickery. The entire act is performed under bright lights in full view of the audience. I know the girl was unharmed because I took her out for a soda after the show. So my father had a lot of these magicians at the club. As I mentioned, his shows were quite varied. I mean, it was a complete vaudeville show. He even had carnival nights, tumbling acts, contortionists, jugglers. And while he did not have clowns, he had slapstick comedy. He didn't have any horses or lions and tigers, but he had dog shows, and he even had canary shows. So it was quite a variety in terms of the shows that he had in Oakland. He even had a Black entertainer, Teddy Peters, and she was billed as the Mae West of Harlem, I think it was. And she was so popular that my father extended her contract another 2 months. I don't know if you've ever heard of acrobatic adagio type of dancing. Let me just kind of blow it up a little bit. And this is an unusual type of dancing. It included not only acrobatic style dancing, but it also involved a very difficult stationary balancing act in its routine. Here you see the sensational Marcos doing this very difficult balancing act, stretched out horizontally. And although I've never seen this type of dancing, I would have loved to seen it if I was old enough. So for the first 2 years of the new Shanghai Cafe, when it opened up into vaudeville, it had over 90 different performing artists. That's amazing. In 1940, my father decided to expand it again, and it morphed from a supper club to a real super nightclub. He renamed it the New Shanghai Terrace Bowl. And you can see in this picture that he built this 40-foot dome over the newer portion of the cafe. Here's an inside look of it. This 40-foot ceiling was painted in midnight blue. It had twinkling stars as if you were outside. You notice all the tables are terraced, so there was no area that you couldn't see the floor show. And that was the reason why it was called, in part, the Terrace Bowl, because of the terraced view that they had. Also, the dance floor was actually dug into the ground below the first floor. And so that's the reason why it was called the bowl, the Terrace Bowl. Here you see some of the early band here, as well as the MC Sammy Tong. Probably some of you know who Sammy Tong was. He was very popular as a master of ceremony at all the different clubs. And he spent a lot of time at my father's clubs. He was probably the most popular master of ceremony as far as my father was concerned. Also, I didn't mention it, but in the earlier picture, there was a Wurlitzer pipe organ built into the stage. And one of the very first persons that my father hired was George Wright. In fact, this was his very first professional job as an organist. He quickly became so popular that, I don't know if you remember this local radio station in Oakland, KLX. He was so popular that they broadcast his music every weeknight. Now, George Wright, after he left the Terrace Bowl and went on to build his career, he became one of the last great theater organists of the golden age of movies. And when he wrote his memoirs, he finally remembered my father giving him his first professional job. As you can see here, and I quote, "Some of my experience would defy telling, would defy postal censor regulations. For one thing, I shared a dressing room with a fan and bubble dancer named Lotus Lee." Lotus Lee, by the way, was actually Japanese. She was from LA. And the reason why she changed her name to Lee was to avoid the intern that she would have been put into during World War II. All of this too for the magnificent sum of $56.60 weekly, paid by my ever-loving boss, Dr. Fong Wan. So he had fond memories of his first gig, you might say, when he started his career. Magic shows, as I mentioned, my father loved magic shows. Chan Lu was an interesting magician. Now, he says here, he became a magician because he was a lousy busboy. He lived in Chicago and he worked as a busboy in a small Chinese restaurant. And he was so uncoordinated that he broke one too many dishes and it was about ready to get fired. And it was his lucky day. During the lunchtime when he was bussing the dishes and broke his last dish, there was a very famous magician having lunch there. And you might recognize the name, Harry Blackstone. He was probably the premier magician in the United States at that time. I don't know if he felt sorry for Chan Lu, but he brought him on as an apprentice. And that's where he learned the art of magic. Now, Chan Lu mentions that while on tour, they were going through a town in Iowa. And back then, probably those folks in Iowa, in this particular town, never ever seen a real live Asian before. So after the performance, the police showed up and they arrested Chan Lu. And they accused him of being a Japanese spy. So fortunately, Harry Blackstone bailed him out, and that's how he got started as a magician. Theda Loy was a fan dancer or bubble dancer. And I understand she was actually born in Oakland. You notice these fans. I suppose you not only have to be an agile dancer, but fairly strong, because I read somewhere that some of these fans, not all of them, but some of these can actually weigh 25 pounds each. I don't know if that's true or not, but that reminds me of a story of another bubble dancer named Noel Toy. Now, whether these fans actually weighed 25 pounds or not, I'm not sure. But the way the story goes is that while she was dancing, and she was dancing at the Forbidden City at this time, she lost her balance and fell on a customer's table while he was eating a dish of chow mein. And without missing a beat, she got up and said, "Oh, excuse me, it's okay, help yourself," meaning the customer can actually help himself with the noodles falling off her hand. You can see by 1941, the end of 1941, New Year's Eve, my father was pushing the new Shanghai Terrace Bowl toward an all Chinese review. And that's where all the clubs in San Francisco, Chinatown were trending. And however, you see George right there. He's not Chinese, but there was no way that my father was going to give him up, because he was one of my father's most favorite entertainers. Anyway, you remember Sammy Tong? He led this particular Asian review. And many of you may know something about Sammy. He was very popular. And let me mention something about the years that you see there. Those are the particular years that Sammy worked at my father's different clubs. It does not mean that he worked there year round. Normally the contracts were from several weeks to several months. So Sammy wasn't there year round, but he was there often enough that he was a mainstay at my father's clubs. Sammy in the 1950s went on to Hollywood. Maybe one of those executive producers that came to the shows saw him and liked him and asked him to come to Hollywood. And probably some of you older folks like me remember this particular show, Bachelor's Father. I think primarily in the 50s. And Sammy was part of the show with John Forsythe and Noreen Corcoran. And it ran from 1957 through 1962, 5 seasons, and it had 157 episodes. These are the Mei Lings, Jackie Mei Ling with Mary Mammon and Dottie's son. Oftentimes they would dance together, other times they would do solo dances, but they were extremely popular. There was Toyette Mar. She was called the Chinese Sophie Tucker because she had a strong delivery, a strong voice. In addition to that, she was a great comedian. As you can see, one review here that says, sings American tunes with the best of the nightclub singers and has a sense of humor unequaled by anyone in show business. So she was very popular. And after the shows, she would get together with a lot of the entertainers, and she had a reputation of being a card shark. Apparently, she was very good at blackjack and would take their money. The Sen Wongs performed a lot at my father's clubs. George Sen and Valerie Wong. Valerie Wong started at the Forbidden City. George Sen didn't even know how to dance. And when he went to see the shows at the Forbidden City, that's where he fell in love at first sight with Valerie. So he had to learn how to dance in order to meet her. So he took dancing lessons and then asked Charlie Lowe to see if he could join a part of the dance group. Charlie hired him, and eventually they became a dancing pair, quite popular. They danced all over the world. And you can see one review here about the Sen Wongs, a good-looking pair of Oriental ballroom dancers who do a pleasing rumba and good cakewalk to get them across. Do you know what a cakewalk is? A cakewalk is a dance that was invented by the Black slaves during the Civil War. It was kind of a strut with the shoulders pinned back, their chin up, and it was to make fun of the slave masters during the Civil War. So that was the cakewalk. And of course, the acrobats that my father brought over. This was probably the first group that he brought over in the early 1940s. It says here, one really genuine Chinese floor show, direct from China. They can't speak English, but what a show they do put on. And so, as I mentioned, this was one of several groups that he brought over during the 1940s. They were under contract for about a year, after which time they can either go back to China or stay here if they can get other contracts and perform. And many of the individuals decided to stay and perform at other clubs. Sometimes my father would allow them to tour the country to gain more exposure. And so there was this one tour in the 40s. I believe it was with this group because I knew it included Lee Fong. And he was so nice about it that he loaned them $5,000 in cash to get started on this tour. He even loaned them his nice big Buick that could comfortably sit, 6 or 7 people. It was that large, the Buick was. And with the expectation that he would get reimbursed, of course, after the tour. So several months later, when they came back, my father greeted them. What he saw was a wrecked Buick, dents on the door, fenders were ready to fall off. Their costumes were all soiled, torn. It seemed like they were never laundered. And also the suitcase that my mother loaned to Lee Fong was all crumbled, all the latches were broken, it was tied together with a string. So I don't know if my father ever got the $5,000 back. The Buick had over $2,800 in damages. So I don't know if he coughed it up to show business or what, but that was his experience, at least with this initial group of acrobats from China. Here you can see some of the acts. The one on the left included Lee Fong on a pole that's 26 feet high. And this was at the terrace bowl because it had a ceiling of 40 feet high. At the other clubs, there were smaller ceilings, so you could not have this particular act at the other clubs. It was only shown at the terrace bowl. And I was always amazed at how they stacked the chairs on these skinny wine bottles with a skinny neck. Here, this was at the Club Shanghai, and I believe the chairs are stacked 4 or 5 high with one acrobat balancing his hand, balancing there on top. At the New Shanghai Terrace Bowl, because of the 40-foot ceiling, you can actually stack the chairs maybe 6, 7, 8 high. And I remember there were actually 2 acrobats standing on the hands there. And then there's Bobby Chan. He was famous for a lot of different acts, but this was one of his particularly favorite ones where he would swing on a trapeze, and then he had these rings twirling on his feet and his arms as he was swinging on the trapeze. Fei Ying, she was a very graceful dancer and performed, and this is a picture of her at the New Shanghai Terrace Bowl in 1943. You see the picture of her dress that she wore in 1943 on the left. And this picture was taken by her daughter last year. And you can see how well preserved and pretty the dress was. So that dress is what, close to 80 years old now? So between 1940, 46, 7 years, he had over 300 entertainers at the Terrace Bowl. That's quite a few. And before I leave the Terrace Bowl, I want to mention this particular rumor that was going around Chinatown at the time. And I'm sure you remember Herb Caen, a very famous, popular gossip columnist with the San Francisco Chronicle. He picked up the story, and it was a particularly busy night at the Terrace Bowl. And my father walked in, sat in the back and just relaxing, having a cup of tea. Suddenly he heard in the kitchen, the cooks and the waitresses arguing with the dishwasher. And they were complaining that the dishwasher was way too slow. He needed to clean more of the dishes because they were running out of clean dishes. So my father went back to the kitchen, scolded and yelled at the dishwasher too. And let me have Herb Caen finish the story. This is what he said. One of the wealthiest Chinese in the country is herbalist Fong Wan. He also runs a vast East Bay night spot called the Shanghai Terrace. A few nights back, his dishwasher quit, walked out. The man who took his place that night, carefully washing all the dirty dishes, was Fong Wan. So after the Terrace Bowl closed, 1946, and the reason why he closed it, that portion of the club, was that he got a very good offer from actually a church to buy that particular section of the building. And so he sold it. He turned the old New Shanghai Cafe right next door into a first-class nightclub, but smaller, called the Club Oakland. And then about a year later, he opens another nightclub, the Club Shanghai in San Francisco. I'm going to talk about these two restaurants and nightclubs together because they basically had the same venue. The Club Shanghai was originally owned by his good friend and business partner, D.W. Lowe. My father actually had a financial interest in the club before he took over the majority stocks, you might say, going back into the 1920s. So the new Shanghai Cafe in 1946 morphed into the Club Oakland. So you can see the advertisement between Club Shanghai and Club Oakland. The venues were very similar. It was basically an all Asian review. Here you see premiering are the fan dancers or the bubble dancers. On the left is Barbara Young, and on the right is Lana Wong. I don't recall them ever dancing together. And if one was dancing at one club, the other would be dancing at the other club. Below Barbara Young on the left is Tony Wing, a very popular ballroom tap dancer. He became a choreographer a little bit later, and we'll talk about him shortly. And of course, the acrobats from China. I think the Young China troupe was either the second or third group that came over. And below him was a magician called Professor Lee Tai King. And they all stayed at our house, actually. Here was the opening night of the Club Shanghai back in July 1947. Notice Jadine Wong paired up with Lee's son. Jadine, you will remember, was the one that ran away from home, ended up in Hollywood. And here she's here at opening night at the Club Shanghai. Kobe Yee, very popular exotic dancer, made her own clothes, costumes. She eventually bought the Forbidden City from Charlie Lowe in the 1960s, her and her family, and continued the Forbidden City for approximately another 10 years. Robin Wing, popular singer, also a master of ceremonies. Actually, Robin was Filipina, but she changed her name to sound more Oriental or more Chinesey. Willie Sang was a young master of ceremonies, was up and coming, also a singer. And Wilbur and Mai Tai Sing, very popular. They were called the Chinese Fred and Ginger. And they performed at all the different clubs. They were always on tour around the world and are great ballroom dancers. Here you see the Young China troupe performing. You see actually Bobby Chang jumping through the hoops there on the left. And these hoops actually had sharp daggers sticking through. And he even admitted as a few times that he was wounded and cut jumping through the hoops and had to get stitches taken care at the hospital. Sometimes in addition to the sharp daggers that were sticking through, there was a flame of fire going around the hoops. You see Charlie Choi, this was probably his most popular type of routine, balancing himself on his elbows, rotating these porcelain dishes. And I know they were porcelain because sometimes they fell off and broke on the floors. And of course, the bubble dancers, as I mentioned. Barbara Young on the left, as you can say, she was very popular at my father's club, danced there many different years. Lana Wong, She was another entertainer that my father brought over from China. And believe it or not, she actually stayed in our house as well. In fact, I remember one evening when all the kids were upstairs, I heard this loud shouting downstairs. And I peeked downstairs, and lo and behold, my mother was arguing with my father. And she really wanted to get Lana out of the house. You can probably understand why. So by the next day, she was gone. Tony Wing, as I mentioned, very popular dancer, ballroom dancer, tap dancer, became a choreographer. His nickname was Chop Suey. And the reason why they called him Chop Suey, because he was actually a mixture of many different races: Chinese, Spanish, Portuguese, Filipino. In fact, his real name was Gonzalo Anthony Lagrimas. And he grew up in Stockton. He started at the Forbidden City, and Charlie said he didn't look Chinese enough. His hair was brown, so Charlie made him dye his hair black. Charlie also told him his eyes were too round, so he made him use, I guess, these colored pencils or these dark pencils to slant his eyes more. And of course, he had to change his name to Wing to make it sound more Chinese. As far as Charlie was concerned, if you didn't look Asian or sound Asian, then you would not dance at his clubs. And of course, the incomparable Toy and Wing. Arguably, they were probably the most famous dynamic dancers during this era. Dorothy was actually Japanese, Dorothy Takahashi. And again, like Lotus Lee, Dorothy had to change her name to avoid being sent to the intern camps. Very popular group, very famous. In fact, Dorothy has a couple of documentaries that were done by her. And if you want to know more about her, you can ask Cynthia or maybe later during the panel discussion. And of course, my grandson, this video was taken last year in 2020. Looks like he wants to be an acrobat, trying to balance his little circle on his head, like Charlie Choi to the right. He's actually doing it. Is he going to make it? Oops. Well, good try.
Calvin, we're at the 7 o'clock hour now.
I'm just going to end it right now.
Oh, okay.
And so I just want to mention, if you want more information, there's a couple of good books out, one by Trina Robbins, The Forbidden City, and also a very colorful book, lots of pictures, by Arthur Dong, The Forbidden City, USA. And of course, you can also ask the people that are with me today, Cynthia and Mimi. They're part of the Grand Avenue Follies, and they're right here with us today. So thank you. I want to end it right now so we can get on to the panel discussion.
Calvin, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That was fascinating. It was great to see the inside of buildings. We have thousands of pictures here in the Oakland History Room, but a lot of them are focused on the outside of buildings as opposed to the interior. So that was very educational to learn about what the inside of those places look like. So thank you so much for that.
Okay, you're welcome.
So now we're going to move on to our other speakers who will talk to us tonight about their experiences. As I mentioned earlier, Cynthia Yee is with us. She was a dancer with the Dorothy Choi show that traveled the world and performed at the Chinese Sky Room in San Francisco's Chinatown. So Cynthia, take it away.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. And thank you, Calvin, for having such a nice presentation, because I actually had the opportunity to dance with quite a few of the performers that you have featured.
Right.
And I just wanted to say that I met Jadine Wong in about 1980s, and not long after, she was honored by the Concert of Excellence in New York, and I had the opportunity to actually dance at the Lincoln Center on the night that she was honored. And I was also a magician's assistant.
Uh-huh.
And so Ahing definitely means a lot to me. And his wife, Bertha, is also from the same hometown that my mother is in, which is was from, which is Vallejo, California.
Oh, mhm.
And I actually, I now have a Showgirl Magic Museum in Chinatown. And I have a small collection of Ahing's magic props. And also I have quite a few magic magic effects that we used. And so if you ever come down to Chinatown, make sure you come to the Showgirl Magic Museum.
Yeah,
I
so,
also had the opportunity to actually perform only for a very short while, maybe 1 week, with Sammy Tong as the MC when he was in the Dorothy Toy Show.
mhm.
And I actually sing a song that was written by Sammy. It's a takeoff on a little risque, has some risque lyrics, and it's quite comedic. And but I do that during our open mic when we have that in Chinatown. And I think well, my most fascinating part of my life, I guess, was traveling with Dorothy Toy and Paul Wing. And for 10 years, I traveled out of a suitcase with Dorothy, and all my show experience is really from her. She was my inspiration and mentor. And I now have the Grant Avenue Follies, which started in 2004 as 4 of us professional dancers that used to work the Forbidden City and Sky Room got together to create a fundraiser for the Chinese Hospital Auxiliary. After that, more people wanted to join our group. And we found out that, I later found out that 80% of the dancers that are part of the Grant Avenue Follies right now are retired school teachers. So they didn't have the chance to join into show business because their mom and dad wouldn't let them. And so they became teachers and professors and educators. And at the age of 65, wanted to dance and do what they always wanted to do in life. And so they are now in their 80s. And many of my dancers range from 66 years old to 86 years old. And so it's something that they always wanted to do and had a passion for. And joining the Grant Avenue Follies was their dream. So if you ever have the chance to come down to Chinatown, make sure you come into the museum. We also have books for you to look through that Calvin just featured. So that's all I have to say, Dorothy.
Okay,
we're
I'm
short on
gonna
time.
share the screen and share some of the images that you sent me. Let's see if we could share the screen.
Is Dorothy Toy still alive?
Unfortunately, she passed away about 2 years ago.
So here is just a few, let's see. This is just some of the things.
That's a picture of me. I am the MC for many of the shows that I produce at the Clarion. And I am actually presenting the first Chinatown Burlesque show.
And that was just last year.
This was right before the shelter in place happen.
Okay. So this is your, this is right after you filmed your video.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I couldn't see it. Okay, here we are. So the Grant Avenue Follies in the month of May, in honor of Asian Pacific Heritage Month, we decided to do a rap, actually record a rap. And because of all the anti-Asian hate that was going on. And so Clara Sue, who you see kneeled there, she actually wrote the rap, and the Grant Avenue Follies, we filmed it, and it has actually gone viral, and we are almost reaching 100,000 views on
Wow.
YouTube. And just only 2 weeks ago, we were on the Steve Harvey show, and it will be actually presented very, very shortly. I don't know the exact date, but we already filmed it. So that particular picture that you see, actually, we had just finished the show with actually Reverend Jesse Jackson when he came to Chinatown in honor of Asian Pacific Heritage Week.
Oh, that's terrific.
Mhm.
And so next in our program, we have Lee Chen. She's a dancer with the Grant Avenue Follies. And she shared with us a few days ago some memories of her late husband, who was the owner of the Dragon A-Go-Go nightclub in the 1960s in San Francisco. So here are a couple of pictures, just a couple of pictures of the Whispers, which was a very popular R&B group in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And Mimi Chen's husband was their manager. And so she shared with us a picture. This is taken from the audience in the Paramount Theater, celebrating the group's 50th anniversary. And here's a picture of Lee Chen. Mimi, you want to share some of your memories?
Okay, this picture was taken at the hotel room at the Cash Creek where the Whispers were going to perform. And back then, they still have 4 Whispers. Now, there's only 3, Lavelle and the Scotty and Walter.
Mm-hmm. The twins.
The twins, yes.
Yes.
The twins. They are the one that make the Whispers. My husband put the Whispers together by making a special with the twins, you know, and they are still actually performing now.
Amazing.
Yes, they still having concerts up to today.
So do you want to share some of your memories of the clubs, the nightclubs?
Sure. I'll take it to the next generation, from Calvin's generation to Cynthia's, and I'll take it to the next generation, which would be after the end of the golden age of Chinese nightclubs, such as the Forbidden City and the Shanghai and the Sky Room. My late husband, Lee Chen, he's an Asian American man who expresses, he crosses boundaries and never bothers him. And he worked with soul groups and soul acts and black acts and R&Bs, which most Asian men don't even think about. But yeah, he loved music. So in the mid 60s, after all the era of the golden age nightclub ended, my late husband opened a nightclub called the Dragon A-Go-Go in the heart of Chinatown, 49 Wentworth Street. And I'm going to talk about 2 groups that went through there. One of them that helped that opened up was the Liverpool Five. They were part of the British invasion back in the mid-60s when they had the Beatles. Well, there was the Liverpool Five. So they were touring the United States and they played at the Dragon and Go-Go, and they packed the place for 3 weeks straight. And my husband had to turn people away. They were so high demand. And while they were here, they recorded with RCA. So the next group I will talk about is the Whispers. Originally, they are from Watts in LA, but they came and live in settled down in East Bay, and they came across to the bridge to Chinatown, of all places, to audition at the Dragon and Go-Go. And that's when my husband became the manager for like 12 years. Yeah. And he actually, so I would say that's the home to the Whispers, the Dragon and Go-Go. That's where they started from. And that's their home. So my husband, so they were just kids when they came. They're like 19, they're like 20 years old. You know, they said, Mr. Chen, we need costume. We need, you know, everything, clothing, whatever. So my husband, an Asian man, he taught them how to dance, some dance step. I mean, you can laugh about it, but he did. He's that kind of guy. And he dressed them, and then he eventually bought a Greyhound bus, and he put the band and the Whisper and put them on the road. So they play throughout the United States all year round. And when they have free time, they come home and they play at the Dragon and Go-Go. Yeah. So they actually made a lot of really big records like And the Beat Goes On and Rock Steady. I think you, Dorothy, you may know this song, right?
For sure, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, so after the Dragon and Go-Go, my husband, again, he crossed boundary. He moved over to Broadway. That's Italian town. Chinese don't go to Broadway. Even me as a kid, I don't cross the street on Broadway. Well, he went over to, he took over Basin Street West. And he played Temptation and the Moby Grape, you know, Frank Tix and all those people, those soul groups and really, really popular groups. And eventually, from there, he moved over across the street to 412 Broadway. And he became partners with Don Cornelius. He's with Soul Train.
Yes.
And the producer from Oakland, his name is Dick Griffey. And they, at the time, I think it was 1974. And Richard Pryor, he recorded his winning breakthrough album, if I may say, That Nigger Crazy. You heard about that one, right?
For
So
sure.
that was really another big thing that happened. It was a really, really big hit. And from there, he, after he dissolved his partnership with Don Cornelius, he produced a show called Bowshot Crummin. He named the place from Soul Train to Hippodrome. And he produced this play called Bowshot Crummin. And after that, he leased it out to this other place called the Soul, what was this, hard rock player like Jerry Garcia, people like that, you know. So they play in his club. Okay, so I'm going to take you back. After that, we sold the property, 412 Broadway, and I will talk a little bit about the Dragon and Go-Go today. Is the resurrection of a new club called the Lion's Den. Okay, and that particular club is the first club that's been open since the entertainment restriction 1984. So that's 37 years. So that is the only nightclub in Chinatown right now. And it's very, very popular, play a lot of music, you can have private parties and a lot of different events. So that's where we're at today.
Well, thank you so much,
You're
Mimi.
welcome.
I want to see if the audience has any questions or comments that they'd like to ask any of our panelists. You can put your questions in the chat too. Do any of the performers teach classes? Someone wants to know.
Mm,
Teach class.
Probably not. I don't have a, we only have workshops during the times that we have a burlesque show. Then we will have workshops in the daytime and the burlesque performance at night. But dance lessons, no, we don't.
Let's see. Someone wants to know, will this be recorded and when will it be available? It'll likely be available next week for those of you who are interested or know people who couldn't make tonight's event. And someone wants to know about contact information for possible program collaboration. If you want any of our speakers, they can talk directly to the person posing that question, Edgar Arellano. And he also says this presentation was amazing and thanks you all. You can write to him directly. He's putting his information in the chat.
Okay.
How old was Mr. Fong to have seen these shows?
Well, I didn't see all the shows, of course. Now, a lot of the stories come from oral history, from the actual interviews of the individual performers. So I was too young, or not even born, in the 30s, of course. And but you would hear these stories after you grow up. And from my older brothers, for example. And but I knew about the entertainers and the magicians that stayed at our house because I was there. And also, when I was old enough, maybe starting around 4 or 5 years old, my mother would take us to the Shanghai Terrace Bowl because she didn't want to leave us at home alone. And we would just sit in the back or in the balcony watching the shows. So.
I'm checking to see if there are any more questions or comments.
A few questions. There's one that says, what's the nightclub restriction Mimi's referring to?
1984.
What was that restriction about?
Oh, they banned it. There was no nightclub they cannot open any nightclub as of 1984.
Did they explain why?
I guess they probably didn't want any new, topless or, or whatever. They didn't really explain why, but there was a restriction placed since 1984, and it was just lifted like a couple years ago.
Okay, so they were kind of trying to control what types of clubs would open in the area?
I think so.
I see.
So since then, if you have a restaurant, you can have entertainment in your restaurant, but they do not have a regular club per se.
Interesting. And that was on both sides of the bay or just San Francisco?
I'm just talking about San Francisco, Chinatown.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions or comments?
There was a question earlier, does the speaker follow in the health aspects of that his father promoted, herbalism and clean eating?
Did you hear that, Calvin?
No, could you speak louder, please?
Do you follow in the health aspects that your father promoted, the herbalism and the clean eating?
Yes, I do. You know, I mean, I'm very careful about my diet. Don't take a lot of sugar or don't eat a whole lot of starch. So as is just kind of a general health issue, I try to maintain a fairly balanced diet. Yes.
I have a question regarding that too. Did anyone else in your family continue your father's in his tradition as an herbalist?
Yes, my oldest brother, the number one son, Dr. Richard Fong, he became a medical doctor in the traditional sense, that he also incorporated herbs into his practice, which was highly unusual. Perhaps he might have been the first Western doctor to include Eastern medicine in his practice. And he practiced on Grand Avenue in Oakland. So yes, my oldest brother did incorporate herbs in his practice. The second son also became a medical doctor, but he did not incorporate any herbs in his practice though.
Interesting.
Where was your father's house?
It was on 10th Street, 10th and Clay. It's still standing. We no longer own the house, but it's still there. And as I understand, I think the city of Oakland was interested in turning it into a historic property, but I think we found it too expensive to renovate it. So we sold the house, but it's still standing, still there. So it's on 576 10th Street in Oakland.
Just a
Maybe
couple.
they should make it a museum.
Would be nice. I don't think it has any of the original architecture in there. When my father had it built, it was pretty much custom. It had teak wood, rosewood, stained glass. All the lanterns were imported from China. And these lanterns were actually, I believe, made by my grandfather. My grandfather was a Chinese lantern artist in Toisan City. And so I'm sure those lanterns came from there. But I don't know if they're there in the house anymore. I haven't been inside that house for many years. I'm not sure what the present owners have done with any of that material anymore, the interior.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for this presentation. This was just fascinating to learn about this aspect of our Chinese American community. So thank you, Calvin, Cynthia, and Mimi. You've kind of opened up our eyes, and you've certainly, with your scrapbooks, Calvin, you've enriched us, our collection here at the Oakland History Center. So I want to thank everybody for coming. Tomorrow, we will continue the Fall History Series. We will have with us California College of the Arts Professor Mitchell Swartzer. I'm going to take my mask off, my goodness. And he has a new book called Hella Town, which is about Oakland's, it's the history of Oakland's development and disruption. It's a new book that was put out by UC Press, and he'll be here 6 o'clock tomorrow on Zoom in Zoom land with me and my colleague Steve Lavoie talking about his new book tomorrow at 6. So if you haven't registered for that, audience, please do. And again, I want to thank our speakers, Cynthia Yee, Lee Chen, and Calvin Fong. Thank you so much.
Okay, welcome.
Thank you,
Thank
Dorothy.
you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for
Thank you.
inviting us. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.